Hey everybody, this is John Walker Webb. I'm a senior here at Madison Central, and today this is the first episode of my podcast, The Webb Perspective. This is a production of JNN. Today I'm joined here by Mr. Brett Mayfield, a long-tenured teacher from everything including psychology, human geography, and just how to be a better person. Mr. Mayfield, would you like to tell the people a little about yourself?
Yeah, I'm glad to be here. I've been teaching at Madison Central for 12 years now. Love it here, and I'm excited about this podcast.
That's awesome. So the idea of this podcast is to focus on a lot of things students might see or look at and go a little more in depth on them. Mr. Mayfield, teaching a lot of psychology, will throw in some good information, stuff that just makes you think, and that's the goal of this. So recently out in the news, it came out that Biloxi School District decided to, quote-unquote, ban To Kill a Mockingbird from their reading list. So I saw this, and I personally was a little outraged. I read that book at the age they read it. I loved the book. I thought it was appropriate. From the reasons I saw, it said something along the lines of, for words that made students uncomfortable. So I just want to get your opinions on your first reaction when you heard about this being banned from the Biloxi School District.
Well, I was kind of surprised, given this is Mississippi, and that book certainly includes a lot of Southern culture in it. But of course, we always want to be sensitive to the needs of students and what makes people uncomfortable. But it's not always the goal of education to make people comfortable. Sometimes it requires discomfort to learn. So I guess I probably had mixed feelings on that. I was struck, as I think you were, by the words that were used to
Can you elaborate a little bit on what those words mean?
You use the term ban, and I did see in some places where the term ban was used in some article titles, but in a lot of places you see the word remove. And what in fact happened was not necessarily a banning. They didn't keep students from reading the book, didn't remove the book from the campus. They just removed it from the reading list for that particular class. Now, it is interesting that they removed the book and they stopped teaching the book mid-lesson. And I think that's where some people were shocked. It wasn't as if they made a careful, calculated decision. They just reacted to parental concern and kind of immediately stopped that. That's a little bit unusual.
So with your psychology background, how exactly would using the word ban or remove as opposed to take off the reading list change the perspective of people when they hear that or see it?
Well, I think it always comes back to kind of the connotative meaning of words. And in this case, ban provokes something, especially in educated people who are familiar with times during which important information was banned. It was not just, in many points in our history, it wasn't just a ban on a particular document because it was inappropriate, but it was a ban to keep the free expression of ideas from happening.
I think it's interesting you bring that up because we were in our newsroom of JNN, and a member of my team, we were talking over different ideas for different news stories, and when he heard about this, he was outraged, and he was thinking of ideas of how to make a video about this and how to educate people on this. And parts of the intro, he considered showing clips of the Nazis burning books, during World War II era Nazi Germany.
Definitely a powerful image.
Yeah, exactly. It was a very, very powerful image, and that's really what struck me as odd. Because that morning on my way to school, a big fan of NPR, I was listening and I heard some people talk about it. From what I understood reading the article, hearing this person speak on NPR, was that it is not banned or removed. It's actually just not being taught anymore, but it's still available. And once I told him that it's still available to students in the library, his mind quickly changed. In fact, when I did some research, I came across something that I found very interesting. It was the fact that every single 8th grader at the school was actually given a copy of To Kill a Mockingbird at the beginning of the year. And so every student at that school still has that copy. They didn't take them back.
Right.
So not only is it available in the library, but every student actually has that. So I'm just going to read some of these, some of the words used in some of the articles. And you just tell me what you think these mean, like when you hear them.
Sure.
National Review, USA Today, and Time Magazine all use the word ban. And this is kind of synonymous with the New York Times word of removed. So I'm just going to read the definitions of those two words real quick. So ban is officially or legally prohibit, and removed is eliminate or get rid of.
Yeah, I think those are valid perspectives, but I think that we got to look at the history of the word ban and other cases when it's been used, because remove is pretty weak. I mean, it's pretty non-confrontational. You know, ban says this is being prohibited, there's almost a sense of urgency about it, where we are actively trying to stop people from doing this. In this case, the book wasn't removed even from the library. It wasn't removed from the students. It was removed from the required reading list. So students weren't required to read it, but it was still available. Ban suggests that, it at least gives the image to me that the teachers went in and took away the books and took it out of the library and tried to scrub all memory of it away. Mm-hmm. And that's not what happened. So
whenever I was reading this, my mind may have wandered a little too far, but the images of yellow journalism came into my mind, which of course yellow journalism is the crude exaggeration or sensationalism of a story for the purpose of selling. And while I was reading through these lists, I Googled "To Kill a Mockingbird" banned in Mississippi schools, and I read every single article I could. The first ones being from the National Review and New York Times. The farther I went down, they changed up a little. So the first one up there is "To Kill a Mockingbird" banned from Mississippi school. But when I got to the very bottom, I found one that said Mississippi School District removes "To Kill a Mockingbird" from 8th grade reading list. So out of those two, which one is more accurate?
Removed from 8th grade reading list.
Right?
Yeah, absolutely.
And so what is the major difference, would you say, between the first one I read and the last one I read?
I think it's how people react to it. And I think we've seen this in social media in recent years, that people respond not necessarily to the content of articles as much as to the headlines. And I wish I could remember which publication put it out, but about 5 or 6 years ago, for April Fool's Day, there was a publication that put out an article with some kind of really gripping headline. And the article itself, and the headline was very, controversial, but the article itself was basically an article about April Fools and didn't have anything to do with the headline. And the kind of trick here was to see how people would respond. And what they found was people wrote comments that were really vitriolic and really angry and going back in response to the headline, having never read the article. So the headlines make a difference. And in many cases, we see this with the kind of focus on fake news and the use of Facebook during the previous election, that these headlines inspire in themselves this kind of emotional response. And that emotional response certainly brings to reality certain actions and attitudes. And what actually is the content doesn't matter as much. And I think in recent days I've read articles where I've thought, oh, that's an interesting headline, I'll check it out, and get halfway through the article and think this has nothing at all to do with this headline. That's not at all what it was characterized as. That's a little disturbing.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. As I did my more research into it, I noticed I read 8 different publications of award-winning news organizations, and they all said the same thing, essentially.
Right.
Until I came across one particular one. And this one was actually published much, much later. So originally, it was October 14th was the date that it was removed from the reading list originally. On October 23rd was the date that a letter was put into action to add it back to the reading list. And I found an article on the one that was published after it was added back. And it intrigued me very much. It was by The Guardian, and it referenced a quote from a woman named Yolanda Williams, and it had a little click on, and I clicked on it, and it took me to a article by the Sun Herald, which is a local Biloxi paper. And so I'd never even thought to even look at a local paper. That thought slipped my mind. But then when I read the article, immediately I was intrigued because it said why it was banned originally, the perspective from the people who caused this banning to happen. And all the articles I read, there was no perspective of someone who was in that school board meeting that was for getting rid of the book.
It was all external people outside of the community.
The majority of what it says was English teachers from like Minnesota saying this is a great book, they need to read it. Was a lot of the sources. So I was originally outraged by it. I really was, because I love the book personally. I think it teaches race issues, especially being from the South, where issues are still real and relevant today. It's a good introduction. So I was looking on this article, and it intrigued me because I found out the reason this book was originally removed from the reading list. So Yolanda Williams and Jessica Williams are a mother and grandmother, and their daughter goes to the Biloxi schools. They are an African-American family who moved here 20 years ago. They are a military family, and dealing with race a lot, it's very important to them. This book is very, important to them. And it turns out during the classroom, when the book was being read, the N-word is in the book a lot, that I'll quote this: "Students were laughing out loud at the teacher's response. 'That's unacceptable to me,' she told the board. 'Is there not a better way to teach about that class in that era and the horrors of that era other than having kids laughing in class when the N-word is said? It should not be required reading for all students. My child should not have to sit in a class like that.'" So from a whole other perspective is the book didn't make people uncomfortable who it needed to make uncomfortable. It made uncomfortable the people who the book was more about. So this young black girl was uncomfortable because people were using the N-word and laughing about it and making fun of the era of which this occurred in.
Right, and I don't know the details of this case in terms of who the teacher was, what their perspective was. I certainly don't want to criticize a fellow teacher because I don't know what her perspective was. But I would certainly say that any teacher who's teaching this book would want to make sure that they teach it with the proper respect due to a serious concern. I mean, we don't want to offend students. We don't want to tiptoe around. But if we are making light of something that actually does real harm to people, that is insulting, that is degrading, we don't want to do that. I think when we laugh at those things, we minimize them. And so maybe that's what she was feeling. Maybe this, grandmother was saying, "Hey, this is a serious book, but we're minimizing it." I don't think the problem here, though, was with the book itself. The problem was with how it was being presented. And maybe the teacher, given more time, would have said, "Hey, guys, let's take this more seriously. Let's look at this. I understand these words make you uncomfortable, but let's talk through it."
I think that's a great point you bring up there. But as I read more of the article, I realized this isn't different than it was originally portrayed. And I think it's interesting that the news headlines that I originally read do not line up with this backstory I found of direct quotes from people who were actually in the school board meeting. So that brings up my one of my major questions for you. So was the goal of the news organizations, and they originally wrote the ban and removed, was their goal to inform the public or inflame the public?
Wow, that's a good question. It's hard to speak to someone else's motives. I think we've seen historically sensationalistic articles. That's not anything new. We've had tabloid journalism going on for, many, many decades, if not centuries in many cases. Pointing out their motives would be impossible to tell. But I think we can see a larger trend that we're seeing headlines that are more sensationalistic than they've traditionally been. We've been able to rely for a long time now on some degree of objectivity. And that may have been an illusion because historically newspapers, magazines, journalists have not been objective, but we've been aware of their lack of objectivity. It's hard to assign motives. I think inflaming people is what's going to bring them back. It's going to get them energized. People respond to how they feel about things more than what they think about things. So I think the larger trend, I'd hesitate to assign motives to these journalists, but I would certainly say at the very least that the larger trend of this sensationalistic style of writing has certainly had an impression on them and maybe influencing the way they write.
Thanks for listening, and we hope you enjoyed. To hear the rest of the conversation, tune in next time. This has been the Webb Perspective.